June 12, 2024, the day Russia moved its nuclear-capable Iskander-M missiles to Belarus wasn't just another escalation in the grinding war in Ukraine. It was the opening gambit in a much larger, much more dangerous game, one that most Western analysts are still refusing to acknowledge. I've been tracking this for decades, and let me tell what we're witnessing isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the end of an era, the unraveling of America's post-Cold War dominance. And Russia? They're not just playing hardball. They're playing chess while the West is still trying to figure out how the pieces move. Now, if you've been following the headlines, you've probably heard some version of Russia is desperate. Putin is cornered. The sanctions are working. Ukraine is winning. NATO is united. The West just needs to hold firm a little longer, and the whole rotten edifice of Putin's regime will collapse. That's the official narrative. And like most official narratives, it's not entirely wrong, just dangerously incomplete. But here's the problem with this: it assumes Russia is reacting, not acting. It assumes this is a war of choice for Moscow, not an existential struggle. And most dangerously, it assumes that time is on the West side. None of those things are true. Let me walk you through what's really happening and why Douglas what they want you to believe. The story goes like Russia's invasion of Ukraine was an unprovoked act of imperial aggression, a throwback to the Soviet era. Putin, isolated and paranoid, miscalculated badly. He thought Ukraine would fall in days. Instead, the brave Ukrainian people, armed with Western weapons and intelligence, have fought the Russian bear to a standstill. The sanctions are crippling Russia's economy. Its military is a hollowed-out shell, plagued by corruption and incompetence. NATO has never been stronger. The US is leading a global coalition to defend democracy. And if we just keep the aid flowing, keep the pressure on, Russia will eventually crack. That's the version you'll hear from the White House, from most think tanks, and from the pages of the New York Times and the Washington Post. It's a comforting story. It's also a fantasy. Now, don't get me wrong, Ukraine has fought with extraordinary courage. The Russian military has made staggering mistakes. And yes, the sanctions have hurt. But the idea that this is some kind of inevitable Western victory? That's where the narrative starts to unravel. Let's look at the numbers. According to the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, the US and its allies have committed over $200 billion in military, economic, and humanitarian aid to Ukraine since February 2022. That's more than the entire annual GDP of countries like Hungary or Ukraine itself before the war. And yet, despite all that money, all those weapons, all that intelligence, Ukraine is losing ground. Slowly, but undeniably. The Institute for the Study of War, which has been one of the most reliable sources on the conflict, reported in May 2024 that Russian forces have made incremental but steady advances in the Donbass, particularly around Avdiivka and Chasiv Yar. Ukrainian troops are exhausted. Their manpower is dwindling. And perhaps most alarmingly, their air defenses are running critically low. The Russians, meanwhile, have adapted. They're not the same army that blundered into Kiev in 2022. They've learned. They've reorganized. And they're fighting a war of attrition, a war they know they can win if the West loses the will to keep funding it. Then there's the sanctions. The Biden administration likes to tout how they've crippled Russia's economy. But here's the inconvenient: Russia's GDP grew by 3.6% in 2023, according to the IMF. That's faster than the US, faster than the EU, and faster than the UK. Inflation? Sure, it spiked early in the war, but it's now back down to around 5%. Unemployment? A mere 3%. And while it's true that some sectors, like high-tech imports, have taken a hit, Russia has found workarounds. China, India, Turkey, the UAE, they've all become critical nodes in a sanctions-busting network that's kept Russia's war machine humming. So if the sanctions aren't collapsing Russia's economy, and if Ukraine is losing ground, why does the West keep insisting that victory is just around the corner? Because admitting the truth would force a reckoning, one that no Western leader, especially not in an election year, wants to face. Deconstructing the what's really happening. Let's start with the most obvious: why is Russia still fighting? If this were just about Ukraine, they would have taken Kiev in 2022, installed a puppet government, and declared victory. But they didn't. Instead, they've settled into a long, grinding war of attrition, one that looks an awful lot like a proxy war against NATO. Here's what most Western analysts refuse to: Russia didn't invade Ukraine because Putin woke up one morning and decided he wanted more territory. He invaded because NATO action had reached a point where Moscow saw it as an existential threat. Now, I'm not saying NATO is to blame for Putin's war. That's a moral cop-out. But if we're being honest about geopolitics, we have to recognize that great powers don't tolerate hostile military alliances on their borders. The US wouldn't tolerate Russian or Chinese bases in Mexico. Why do we expect Russia to tolerate NATO in Ukraine? Putin has been warning about this for years. In 2007, at the Munich Security Conference, NATO action represents a serious provocation that reduces the level of mutual trust. And we have the right to. Against whom is this action intended? In 2008, Russia invaded Georgia after NATO promised Tbilisi eventual membership. In 2014, Russia annexed Crimea after Ukraine's pro-Russian president was ousted in a Western-backed coup. And in 2021, Putin published a 5,000-word essay arguing that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, a clear signal that he saw Ukraine's drift toward the West as an intolerable red line. Now, you can argue that Putin is wrong. You can argue that Ukraine has the right to choose its own alliances. But you can't argue that Russia's actions are irrational. They're the actions of a great power that sees its core security interests being threatened and is willing to go to war to defend them. But here's where it gets really interesting. Russia isn't just fighting Ukraine. It's fighting a proxy war against NATO. And it's winning. Let's look at the 1. NATO is running out of ammunition. The US and Europe have been draining their stockpiles to supply Ukraine. The Pentagon has admitted that it's struggling to replenish its own reserves, let alone keep up with Ukraine's needs. Meanwhile, Russia has ramped up its defense production to Soviet-era levels. In 2023, Russia produced more artillery shells than the US and Europe combined. That's not a typo. Combined. 2. Ukraine's manpower crisis is real and getting worse. The Ukrainian military has been relying on mass mobilization, but that's unsustainable. Reports from the front lines suggest that Ukrainian units are under strength, with some brigades operating at 30 to 40% of their intended manpower. The average age of a Ukrainian soldier is now over 40. Meanwhile, Russia has been quietly mobilizing hundreds of thousands of troops, many of them from poorer regions like Dagestan and Buryatia, where the economic incentives to enlist are strong. 3. The West's unity is cracking. The EU's latest aid package for Ukraine was held up for months by Hungary's Viktor Orbán. Slovakia's new government has halted military aid. And in the US, the $60 billion aid package for Ukraine only passed after months of political infighting and only because the Biden administration framed it as a way to counter China. Even now, there's no guarantee that future aid will be approved, especially if Trump wins in November. 4. Russia's economy is adapting. Yes, the sanctions hurt. But Russia has found ways to mitigate the damage. It's selling oil to India and China at a discount. It's importing Western technology through third countries. And it's investing heavily in its own defense industry. The result? Russia's economy is growing, its military is exting, and its government is more stable than at any point since the war began. So what's really going on here? Russia is playing the long game. They know they can't lose this war. Not because they're winning on the battlefield, but because they know the West doesn't have the stomach for a protracted conflict. They know that every month that passes, the political will in Washington and Brussels erodes a little more. They know that if they can hold out until the US election, they might get a deal, one that leaves them in control of the territories they've seized, and Ukraine permanently neutralized. And that brings us to Douglas Russia's grand strategy. I've known Doug. Russia is not fighting for territory. It's fighting for survival. And it's willing to escalate dramatically to achieve its goals. Let's break down his. 1. Russia's war aims are not limited to Ukraine. Putin has been this is about rolling back NATO action, reasserting Russia's sphere of influence, and forcing the West to accept a new security architecture in Europe. That's not just rhetoric. It's a strategic objective. And Russia is willing to use nuclear threats, energy blackmail, and even direct military strikes against NATO targets to achieve it. 2. The West is underestimating Russia's resolve. This is just fearmongering. Russia wouldn't dare attack NATO. Putin isn't suicidal. And you're right, Putin isn't suicidal. But he's also not bluffing. And that's the problem. The broader geopolitical world in transition. Let's out for a moment. Because this isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the end of the unipolar moment, the period after the Cold War when the US was the world's sole superpower. And it's about the rise of a multipolar world, where power is diffused among multiple Washington, Beijing, Moscow, and maybe even New Delhi and Ankara. For the past 30 years, the US has operated under the assumption that it could shape the world in its image. We invaded Iraq to spread democracy. We exited NATO to contain Russia. We waged a global war on terror to eliminate threats before they reached our shores. And for a while, it worked. The Soviet Union collapsed. China was still rising. Russia was weak. The US was the undisputed hegemon. But that world is gone. And the longer the US clings to the idea that it can maintain its dominance through military force and economic coercion, the more dangerous the world becomes. Let's look at the three major players in this new great. 1. The declining hegemon. The US is still the world's most powerful country. But its power is eroding. Its debt is unsustainable. Its infrastructure is crumbling. Its political system is polarized. And its military, while still dominant, is overstretched. The US is trying to contain China in the Indo-Pacific, counter Russia in Europe, and manage crises in the Middle East all at the same time. That's not a strategy. That's a recipe for exhaustion. The Biden administration's approach to Ukraine is a perfect example of this overreach. The US is spending billions to fight a proxy war against Russia, while China watches and learns. And what's the endgame? A negotiated settlement that leaves Ukraine neutral? A frozen conflict that drags on for years? Or a direct confrontation with Russia that could escalate into nuclear war? 2. The revisionist power. Russia is not a global superpower. But it's a regional hegemon with nuclear weapons, energy resources, and a willingness to use force to defend its interests. Putin's goal is not to recreate the Soviet Union. It's to restore Russia's status as a great power, one that is respected, feared, and treated as an equal by the West. The war in Ukraine is Russia's way of forcing the US to recognize its sphere of influence. And if the US refuses? Russia is willing to escalate. That could mean cyber attacks on Western infrastructure. It could mean strikes on NATO supply lines. Or it could mean, in the worst-case scenario, a limited nuclear strike to demonstrate resolve. 3. The rising challenger. China is the real long-term threat to US dominance. But unlike Russia, China is playing a smarter game. It's not picking fights it can't win. It's biding its time, building its economy, and extending its influence through trade and investment. The war in Ukraine is a gift to China. It's distracting the US from the Indo-Pacific. It's weakening Russia, which could make Moscow more dependent on Beijing. And it's giving China a front-row seat to study how the US fights and how it might be defeated. If the US gets bogged down in a protracted war with Russia, China will be in a prime position to make its move on Taiwan. And that's a war the US cannot afford to lose. So where does this leave us? We're in the early stages of a new Cold War, one that's even more dangerous than the last, because it's not just a bipolar struggle between the US and the USSR. It's a multipolar competition, with multiple centers of power, multiple flashpoints, and no clear rules of engagement. And the war in Ukraine? It's the first major battle of this new era. And right now, Russia is winning. Military and strategic, the illusion of a limited war. Let's talk about the military reality on the ground. Because if there's one thing that should keep policymakers up at night, it's the West is fighting a 21st century war with 20th century tactics and Russia is adapting faster. Here's what's really happening in 1. The air Russia's dominance. Ukraine's air defenses are collapsing. The US has sent Patriot systems, but they're not enough. Russia has been systematically targeting Ukraine's air defense infrastructure, and it's working. In May 2024, Russian missiles struck a Ukrainian military base in the western city of Lviv, a clear signal that no part of Ukraine is safe. The US has been reluctant to send F-16s to Ukraine, fearing escalation. But without air superiority, Ukraine's ground forces are vulnerable. And Russia knows it. That's why they've been able to make slow but steady advances in the Donbass. 2. The artillery Russia's firepower advantage. Russia is outgunning Ukraine by a factor of 5-1 in artillery. That's not hyperbole. That's the reality on the ground. Ukrainian troops are being pounded by Russian artillery, while their own guns are running out of shells. The US and Europe have been scrambling to ramp up production, but it's not enough. Russia, meanwhile, has turned its economy into a war machine. It's producing more artillery shells than the US and Europe combined. And it's not just quantity, it's quality. Russia's new generation of smart artillery is more accurate and more lethal than anything Ukraine has. 3. The manpower Ukraine's collapse. Ukraine's military is exhausted. The average age of a Ukrainian soldier is now over 40. The country has lost hundreds of thousands of troops, and its manpower pool is dwindling. Russia, meanwhile, has been quietly mobilizing hundreds of thousands of troops, many of them from poorer regions where the economic incentives to enlist are strong. The Ukrainian government has been reluctant to admit the scale of the problem, but the signs are everywhere. Reports from the front lines suggest that Ukrainian units are operating at 30 to 40% of their intended strength. And morale is collapsing. In some units, soldiers are refusing to fight. For the escalation, how far will Russia go? The biggest question: what happens when Ukraine collapses? And make no mistake, it's a question of when, not if. If the US cuts off aid, Ukraine will run out of ammunition, air defenses, and man-power in the next 6 months. Russia knows this, and it's preparing for the endgame. The question isn't whether Ukraine can hold out, it's what Russia does after the collapse. And that's where things get truly dangerous. Now, what most people don't realize is that Russia's strategy isn't just about Ukraine. It's about reshaping the entire European security architecture. Putin has been explicit about this for years, but Western leaders have either ignored him or dismissed him as a madman. The 2021 draft treaties Russia presented to NATO and the US weren't just diplomatic posturing, they were a blueprint for a new order. Moscow demanded legally binding guarantees that NATO would halt its eastward action, withdraw forces from Eastern Europe, and essentially return to the 1997 borders. The West rejected these demands outright, but Russia didn't back down. Instead, it doubled down. Here's the uncomfortable: Russia sees this war as existential. Not just for Ukraine, but for its own survival as a great power. The Kremlin believes that if Ukraine joins NATO, Russia will be encircled by a hostile military alliance with advanced strike capabilities. And they're not wrong to think that. The US has been deploying long-range missiles in Europe, like the Tomahawks and SM-6s, that can hit Moscow in minutes. Russia's nuclear doctrine allows for the use of tactical nukes if it perceives an existential threat. That's not just rhetoric. It's written into their military planning. Let me explain why this matters. If Ukraine collapses, Russia won't stop at the Dnipro. They'll push to the borders of Poland and Romania, creating a buffer zone that NATO can't penetrate. And that's when things get really messy. The US has already warned that any attack on NATO territory would trigger Article 5. But what happens if Russia doesn't launch a full-scale invasion of Poland? What if they use hybrid warfare, sabotage, cyber attacks, or even a false flag operation to test NATO's resolve? The alliance is already divided. Hungary and Slovakia have been openly skeptical of supporting Ukraine. France and Germany are at odds over defense spending. And the US, under a potential second Trump administration, might not be as committed to Europe's defense as it has been. This brings me to the military implications. Russia has been preparing for a larger war for years. Their military reforms, which began after the 2008 Georgia War, have transformed their armed forces into a more professional, agile, and lethal force. They've increased defense spending by over 70% since 2014, and their military-industrial complex is now operating at full capacity. The West, meanwhile, has been complacent. NATO's defense spending has only recently started to tick up, and even then, it's not enough. The US has been focused on China, and Europe has been slow to adapt. Russia's advantage isn't just in numbers, it's in doctrine. They've studied the US way of war and adapted. Their military now emphasizes electronic warfare, long-range precision strikes, and massed artillery, exactly what they're using in Ukraine. They've also invested heavily in hypersonic missiles, which can evade US missile defenses. The Kinzhal and Avangard systems give Russia a first-strike capability that could cripple NATO's command and control in the opening hours of a conflict. Now, let's talk about the nuclear angle. Russia has been modernizing its nuclear arsenal at an alarming rate. They've deployed new ICBMs like the Sarmat, which can carry multiple warheads and evade missile defenses. They've also developed the Poseidon nuclear torpedo, a doomsday weapon designed to create radioactive tsunamis. The US has been slow to respond. The last time the US tested a nuclear weapon was in 1992. Russia, on the other hand, has conducted multiple tests of its new systems. Here's the Russia's nuclear doctrine allows for the use of tactical nukes in a conventional conflict if it perceives a threat to its territorial integrity. That's not just a theoretical scenario. If Russia pushes into NATO territory and the alliance responds with conventional forces, Moscow could escalate to nuclear weapons. And once the threshold is crossed, there's no going back. The West has been playing checkers while Russia has been playing chess. The US and NATO have been focused on short-term fixes, sending more weapons, training more troops, imposing more sanctions. But Russia has been playing the long game. They've been building alliances with China, Iran, and North Korea. They've been developing alternative payment systems to bypass Western sanctions. And they've been preparing their population for a prolonged war. Let me give you an example. In 2023, Russia's GDP grew by 3.6%, despite Western sanctions. That's not because the sanctions aren't working, it's because Russia has adapted. They've rerouted trade through China, India, and the Middle East. They've increased domestic production of everything from microchips to missiles. And they've turned their economy into a war economy. The West, meanwhile, is still debating whether to send more artillery shells to Ukraine. The bottom line is Russia is winning the war in Ukraine, and the West is running out of options. The longer this drags on, the worse it gets for Ukraine. And if Ukraine collapses, the geopolitical fallout will be catastrophic. NATO will be forced to confront Russia directly, and the risk of a wider war will skyrocket. The question isn't whether the West can turn the tide, it's whether it's already too late. And the answer, unfortunately, is that it might be.